He thought one loud command could erase a man, but he had no idea the entire terminal was about to turn against him. Get out. The words exploded across Terminal B at exactly 2:17 p.m., sharp enough to slice through the constant hum of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements. And for a split second, everything slowed, as if the airport itself held its breath, eyes shifting toward a single figure standing near Gate 23, Daniel Carter, a quiet janitor in a faded Navy uniform. His mop still pressed lightly against the polished floor that reflected the overhead lights like glass, his posture calm, almost too calm for someone just publicly dismissed, while across from him stood Richard Vaughn, the airport manager, his tailored suit crisp, his jaw tight, his finger extended like a verdict already passed, a man used to being obeyed without question, a man who believed authority was something you asserted, not something you earned. And around them, passengers paused mid-step. A businessman froze with his phone halfway to his ear. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand, and a group of college students exchanged glances that said something felt off. Because Daniel didn't react the way people expected, he didn't argue, didn't apologize, didn't even step back. He simply looked at Vaughn with steady eyes, the kind that didn't flinch under pressure, the kind that suggested this moment wasn't as simple as it appeared, and Vaughn mistook that silence for defiance, his voice rising again, louder this time, echoing off the high ceilings. I said you don't belong here. Each word landing heavier than the last, drawing more attention, more eyes, more quiet witnesses, and somewhere near the boarding line, a woman in her 60s tilted her head, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition, her lips parting slightly, as if she was about to say something but wasn't sure yet, while a TSA officer a few yards away straightened subtly, his gaze narrowing, and Daniel still didn't move, the air thickening with tension, the kind that builds before something irreversible happens. Because what Vaughn didn't see, what he couldn't see, was the subtle shift beginning at the edges of the crowd, the almost invisible current passing from one person to another, the quiet realization forming in real time. And in that growing silence, louder than any shout, the balance of power began to tilt, just slightly at first, just enough to matter, and Daniel Carter, the man everyone had overlooked just seconds ago, was no longer invisible. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a ripple moving through still water, and Richard Vaughn felt it before he fully understood it, the subtle change in posture from the people around him. The way eyes no longer followed his command but instead lingered on the man he had just dismissed, and for the first time in a long while, his certainty hesitated, but pride moved faster than doubt, and he straightened his shoulders, adjusting his jacket as if restoring control could be done with a single motion. Security is on the way, he said, his voice sharper now, louder, trying to reclaim the authority he believed was slipping. But the words did not land the same way anymore, not with the same weight, because something unspoken had already begun to form in the crowd, something that did not need permission to exist, and Daniel Carter remained exactly where he was, one hand resting lightly on the handle of his mop, his expression composed, almost reflective, as if he had seen moments like this before, as if he understood something deeper than the surface tension filling the terminal. And near the boarding line, the older woman finally took a step forward, her voice soft but clear enough to carry. "Excuse me," she said, and the single phrase cut through the air with unexpected precision, drawing attention not because it was loud, but because it was certain. And Vaughn turned toward her with visible impatience, clearly not expecting interruption, but she did not look at him the way others did. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no deference, only recognition, and that was what unsettled him most. "I think you should reconsider," she added, her tone calm, measured, as if she were stating something already decided, and a murmur followed, low at first, then building, as a few others shifted closer, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but deliberately, like pieces moving into place on a board. Vaughn did not realize he was losing, and the TSA officer who had been watching from a distance took a step nearer as well, his stance neutral but attentive, his eyes now fixed not on Daniel, but on Vaughn, and that subtle redirection did not go unnoticed, because in a place where hierarchy was everything, attention was currency, and Vaughn was no longer the only one holding it. And still, Daniel said nothing. his silence no longer passive, but powerful, as if he understood that speaking too soon would diminish what was already unfolding around him. And the businessman who had frozen earlier lowered his phone slowly, not returning to his call, but watching, waiting, and then another voice emerged from somewhere behind, quieter but firm. He has been here longer than most of us. And that sentence, simple as it was, carried weight, because it was not just a defense, it was a reminder. And Vaughn's expression tightened, the edges of control beginning to fray, because this was no longer about a wet floor or a misplaced accusation. This was something else entirely, something he had not prepared for. And as the crowd subtly closed the distance, not surrounding, but supporting, the invisible lines of authority began to blur, and for the first time, Richard Vaughn was no longer the center of the moment. He was standing inside it, unsure of where it was going, while Daniel Carter, the man he had tried to erase, remained still at the center of a quiet shift that was only just beginning to reveal its full weight. The tension did not explode. It deepened, settling into the kind of silence that made every small movement feel amplified, and Richard Vaughn could feel it pressing in from all sides. No longer just a situation to manage, but something watching him, measuring him, and quietly judging. And for a man who had built his authority on control, that shift was unfamiliar, almost unsettling. "This is not a discussion," he said, his voice tighter now, less confident than before, though he tried to mask it with formality. "Airport policy is clear." But even as he spoke, the words felt rehearsed, disconnected from the reality unfolding in front of him. Because the people around him were no longer responding to policy. They were responding to something human, something immediate, and the older woman stepped closer to Daniel, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "You probably do not remember me," she said gently, and Daniel's gaze shifted to her for the first time, not defensive, not surprised, just present, as if he had been expecting this moment to arrive in its own time, and she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried history. "3 winters ago, my husband collapsed right over there." She gestured toward a distant seating area near the windows. "Everyone panicked, but you did not." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. "You stayed with him until help arrived. You kept him talking, you kept me calm." A hush fell deeper over the terminal, the kind that silenced even the distant announcements, and a man standing nearby shifted forward, nodding slowly as recognition sparked in his eyes. "I have seen that too," he added, his tone steady. "Late nights, early mornings, he is always here, helping people no one else notices." And the TSA officer took another step forward, his presence now unmistakably aligned, not with authority, but with truth. "He has assisted our team more than once," he said, not loudly, but with enough clarity that the words carried weight, and Vaughn's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the fracture beneath his composure, because this was no longer a single voice challenging him. It was a pattern forming, a narrative he had not controlled, and Daniel still did not speak, his silence now no longer empty, but filled with everything being said around him, each word layering into something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed with a raised voice or a pointed finger. And the businessman who had been watching finally stepped closer as well, lowering his voice, but ensuring it was heard. "I travel through here every week," he said, "and I have seen him treat every person with more respect than most people in suits ever do." And that line hung in the air, heavier than any accusation, because it was not an attack, it was a comparison, and Vaughn felt it, the weight of it, pressing against the image he had carefully maintained, and for the first time, he glanced at Daniel not as an inconvenience, not as an employee, but as a man surrounded by something he could not command, something he could not override. And in that moment, the balance shifted further, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with quiet certainty, as the invisible man he had tried to remove became the center of a truth that was no longer his to control. Richard Vaughn opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out at first, only a slight tightening in his jaw as the weight of what had just been said settled around him, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet pressure that made the polished floors and high ceilings feel smaller than they had moments ago. And for the first time since he had stepped into this confrontation, he was no longer speaking from certainty, he was reacting, trying to regain ground that was steadily shifting. Beneath him, that may be, he began, his voice measured but lacking its earlier sharpness. But procedures still apply. And even as he said it, the phrase sounded distant, almost irrelevant, because the people around him were no longer listening for rules. They were listening for truth. And the older woman shook her head slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet disbelief, as if she had heard enough to understand exactly what kind of moment this had become. And somewhere behind the growing circle, a young airport employee stepped forward, hesitating only briefly before speaking. "He trained me my first week here," she said, her voice steady despite the attention. "When I did not know where anything was, when I was overwhelmed, he stayed after his shift to help me figure it out." Her words were simple, but they added another layer, another piece to the picture forming in real time, and Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not out of shame, but humility, as if recognition was something he had never sought, something that now felt almost heavier than the accusation that had started it all. And the TSA officer folded his arms, not as a barrier, but as a statement of presence, his stance firm, grounded, signaling that this moment had crossed beyond routine, beyond hierarchy, into something that demanded acknowledgement. And Vaughn could feel it, the collective shift, the way the crowd was no longer passive, the way their attention was no longer his to direct. And he adjusted his stance again, a subtle step back that he likely did not even realize he had taken, but others noticed, because in spaces like this, power was often measured in inches, in posture, in who held their ground and who did not. And Daniel had not moved at all, not a single step, his presence quiet but immovable, like something rooted deeper than the surface tension of the moment. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his tone, he finally spoke. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said, his words calm, deliberate, carrying further than any shout had before. "I am here to do my job." And the simplicity of that statement landed harder than anything else that had been said, because it stripped the situation down to its core, removing all assumptions, all projections, leaving only truth. And the businessman nodded slowly, almost to himself, as if confirming something he had already understood, while a few others exchanged glances that no longer carried uncertainty, but agreement. And Vaughn exhaled quietly, the sound barely noticeable, but in that breath was the first real sign that the control he had relied on was no longer his to claim, and the space between him and Daniel, only a few feet across, now felt like a divide he could not easily cross back over, not without confronting something he had not intended to face. And as the terminal remained still, suspended in that moment, it became clear that whatever happened next would not be decided by authority alone, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of everything that had just been revealed. The stillness did not break. It deepened into something heavier, something undeniable, and Richard Vaughn felt it settle around him like a weight he could not push away, his eyes flicking briefly across the faces in front of him, searching for support, for agreement, for anything that would restore the structure he was used to. But what he found instead was something far more unsettling, quiet conviction, and it did not come from one person. It came from many, layered together, steady and unshaken. And for a moment, he stood there, caught between what he had said and what he now understood. And that gap, that space between intention and reality, was where his authority began to fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be reversed. And behind him, the faint sound of approaching footsteps signaled the arrival of security, two officers moving with professional calm, their presence usually enough to settle any disruption. But this time, they slowed as they approached, their attention drawn not to Daniel, but to the unusual alignment of the crowd, the way people were positioned, not scattered, but subtly unified. And one of them glanced toward the TSA officer, who gave a slight nod, not a command, not an order, just an acknowledgement. And that small exchange carried more weight than any raised voice, because it confirmed what was already clear. This was not a situation that needed removal. It was one that required understanding, and Vaughn noticed it, the hesitation, the lack of immediate compliance, and something inside him shifted again, a realization forming that this was no longer under his control in the way he had assumed. And Daniel remained still, his hands relaxed, his presence steady, not resisting, not retreating, simply existing with a quiet certainty that now filled the space more than any authority could. And then, without planning it, without signaling to anyone, the older woman straightened her posture and remained standing, fully, intentionally, and beside her, the businessman followed, then the young employee, then another traveler, and another, until what had been a scattered group became something else entirely, a silent line of people choosing not to sit, not to move, not to look away, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but powerful in its simplicity, because in a place built on motion, on constant movement, stillness became a statement, and Vaughn felt it, the shift in gravity, the way the moment no longer belonged to him. And for the first time, his voice did not rise, did not command, it faltered, just slightly, as he looked at Daniel, truly looked at him, not as a role, not as a position, but as a person surrounded by something he had underestimated. And Daniel met his gaze calmly, without challenge, without triumph, just presence. And that was what made it undeniable, because there was nothing to fight, nothing to argue against, only a truth that had revealed itself piece by piece, through voices, through memories, through quiet acts that had gone unnoticed until now. And as the terminal remained still, filled with people who had chosen to stand, not out of protest, but out of recognition, Vaughn understood, perhaps for the first time, that respect could not be demanded, it could only be revealed, and in that moment, it had already been given, just not to him. For a long moment, no one moved, and that stillness became louder than any argument that could have been made, filling the terminal with a kind of clarity that did not need explanation, and Richard Vaughn stood in the center of it, no longer directing the scene, but standing inside its consequences, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty, his posture subtly lowered, as if the weight of every quiet voice, every memory spoken, had settled onto him at once, and the security officers remained where they were, not advancing, not intervening, their presence now symbolic rather than authoritative, because the situation had already resolved itself without force, and Vaughn glanced at them briefly, as if expecting action, but none came, only calm observation, and that absence of enforcement said more than any command could have, and Daniel Carter remained where he had always been, his hand still resting on the handle of his mop, his uniform unchanged, his expression steady, but now the space around him felt different, not because he had stepped forward, but because everyone else had finally seen him, and the older woman exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing, as if a quiet truth had finally been acknowledged, and the businessman gave a small nod. Almost imperceptible, but enough to signal that something had been settled, something beyond policy, beyond titles, and Vaughn finally spoke again. But this time his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "That will be all," he said, though the words felt incomplete, lacking the authority they once carried, and no one moved immediately, because the moment did not belong to his words anymore. It belonged to what had already been revealed, and after a few seconds, the crowd began to shift, not hurried, not chaotic, but calm, people returning to their gates, their conversations quieter now, more thoughtful, as if they carried something with them that had not been there before, and the older woman gave Daniel a final look of gratitude before turning away, while the young employee offered a small, respectful smile, and even the TSA officer stepped back into position with a subtle nod, acknowledging not just Daniel, but the moment itself, and Vaughn stood there a second longer, watching as the space returned to its normal rhythm. But something had changed, something he could not undo, and Daniel finally moved, just one step forward, then another, pushing his mop gently across the floor as if nothing had happened, as if this was simply another part of his day. And that was what made it unforgettable, because there was no victory claimed, no recognition demanded, only quiet continuation. And as the polished surface reflected the movement of travelers once again, it also reflected something else, something less visible but far more lasting. The moment when a man who had been overlooked became undeniable, not through power, not through force, but through the simple, steady truth of who he had always been. The terminal slowly returned to motion, but the rhythm had changed, not in speed, not in sound, but in awareness, as if something invisible had been lifted into view and could not be unseen. and Daniel Carter continued his work with the same quiet precision, guiding the mop across the polished floor in steady, deliberate strokes, his reflection moving with him under the bright overhead lights, unchanged in appearance, yet undeniably different in presence. Because now people noticed, not in obvious ways, not with stares or interruptions, but in small, subtle acknowledgments, a slight nod from a passing traveler, a brief pause from a flight attendant who had just minutes earlier walked by without a glance. And these moments, quiet as they were, carried more meaning than any applause ever could. And a few yards away, Richard Vaughn remained where he stood, his hands now resting at his sides, his expression composed but distant, as if replaying the last few minutes in a way that did not quite align with how he had expected them to unfold. And for a man accustomed to control, the absence of it lingered longer than the moment itself, and he turned slightly, watching as Daniel moved through the space with calm focus, unaffected by what had just happened. And that was what unsettled him most, not defiance, not resistance, but composure, because it left no room for correction, no space to reassert dominance, only reflection. And nearby, the young airport employee returned to her station, but her posture carried a new sense of confidence, as if standing up, even quietly, had shifted something within her, while the TSA officer resumed his position with the same professionalism as before, though his gaze followed Daniel for just a moment longer, acknowledging without words what had been proven. And as passengers continued toward their gates, a low murmur of conversation threaded through the space, not chaotic, not disruptive, but thoughtful, people sharing what they had seen, processing it in real time. And Daniel paused briefly near a row of seats, adjusting the caution sign beside him before continuing, his movements unhurried, grounded, as if the weight of recognition had not changed his purpose, only clarified it for those around him. And across the terminal, Vaughn finally took a step, then another, not toward Daniel, but away, his pace measured, his shoulders no longer carrying the same rigid certainty as before. And though no words were exchanged, the distance between them now held something far more powerful than confrontation. It held understanding, the kind that arrives quietly, without announcement, and stays long. After the moment has passed, and as the announcement for boarding echoed overhead once more, blending back into the familiar rhythm of travel, the space carried forward, but not unchanged. Because for those who had witnessed it, something had shifted, something simple and undeniable, that respect was not tied to position, nor granted by authority, but revealed in moments when no one expected it. And Daniel Carter, the man who had once been invisible, moved forward through the terminal exactly as he always had, only now, the world moved a little differently around him. The airport moved forward, but something lingered beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. And Daniel Carter continued along his route, guiding the mop with the same steady rhythm, passing gate 24, then gate 25, each step measured, familiar, yet now carrying the weight of something newly seen. And as he worked, small moments followed him, not loud, not attention-seeking, but undeniable. A pilot passing by slowed just enough to nod in acknowledgement. A mother gently reminded her child to step aside and whispered something that made the child glance back at Daniel with quiet curiosity. And even the cleaning cart parked near the corner seemed to mark a space that was no longer overlooked. And Daniel noticed these things, not with surprise, but with a quiet awareness, the kind that comes from years of understanding people without needing them to say much. And he did not change his pace, did not seek interaction, because his purpose had never been to be seen, only to serve, and that purpose remained unchanged, even if the world around him had shifted slightly. And across the terminal, Richard Vaughn stood near a column, his posture no longer rigid, his arms loosely at his sides, watching the flow of people resume. But his attention kept returning to the same point, to the man moving steadily across the floor, and there was something in that image that stayed with him, not as a challenge, but as a realization, something that had not been part of his thinking before, something that could not be dismissed as easily as policy or procedure. And he exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before lifting again, as if recalibrating not just his authority, but his understanding of it. And nearby, The young airport employee who had spoken earlier adjusted her badge, her expression thoughtful, as she greeted a passenger with more care than usual, her voice softer, more attentive, as if the moment she had witnessed had quietly reshaped how she chose to show up. And the TSA officer, standing once again at his post, maintained his professional stance. But his eyes carried a different awareness, scanning not just for security, but for something deeper, something that could not be measured by routine alone. And as Daniel reached the end of the terminal, he paused briefly, placing the caution sign near a freshly cleaned area, his movements precise, practiced, and then he looked up, just for a second, taking in the space around him, not with pride, not with expectation, but with a calm understanding that moments like this did not change who he was. They simply revealed it to others, and he returned to his work without hesitation, blending once again into the rhythm of the airport, yet leaving behind something that would not easily disappear, because for those who had seen it, truly seen it, the image remained, not of a man being dismissed, but of a man standing still while the world around him finally learned to stand with him. And somewhere in that realization, quiet but lasting, the meaning of respect had shifted, no longer tied to titles or authority, but to something far more enduring, the way a person shows up when no one is watching, and what happens when, suddenly, everyone is. The day continued, flights boarding and departing with mechanical precision, announcements echoing across the terminal in familiar intervals. But beneath that routine, something quieter remained, something that had settled into the awareness of those who had been there, and Daniel Carter moved through it all with the same steady rhythm, turning corners, guiding his cart past rows of waiting passengers, his presence once again blending into the background, yet never fully invisible the way it had been before, because now, even in passing glances, there was recognition, not loud, not performative, but real. And near gate 27, a young boy tugged gently on his father's sleeve, whispering something before pointing toward Daniel, and the father nodded, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, as if passing along a lesson that did not need many words, and Daniel noticed the gesture, offering a small, respectful nod in return before continuing on, his focus never drifting far from the work in front of him. And across the terminal, Richard Vaughn remained in motion as well, though his steps were slower, more deliberate, as if each one required a decision he had not needed to make before, and he paused near a glass wall overlooking the runway, watching a plane taxi into position, its engines humming steadily, and for a moment, he seemed to anchor himself in that sound, in something predictable, something controlled. But even there, his thoughts returned to what had unfolded, to the way the moment had shifted beyond his reach, and to the man at the center of it who had never once raised his voice. And Vaughn exhaled again, this time longer, as if letting go of something he had been holding on to without realizing it. And when he turned back toward the terminal, his gaze moved differently, not scanning for efficiency, not measuring compliance, but observing, taking in details he had once overlooked. And he saw the young employee greeting passengers with a quiet confidence, the TSA officer standing with a heightened awareness, and in the distance, Daniel Carter continuing his work with the same calm presence that had now taken on a new meaning. And Vaughn hesitated, just briefly, before taking a step in that direction, not with urgency, not with authority, but with intention, and though the distance between them was not far, it carried the weight of everything that had happened, and Daniel, sensing movement, looked up slightly, meeting Vaughn's gaze for a moment that held no tension, no expectation, only acknowledgement. And Vaughn stopped a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid, his voice when it came quieter than it had ever been. "The floor looks good," he said, simple, almost understated, but in those words was something more than observation, something that had not been there before, and Daniel nodded once, not as acceptance, not as submission, but as recognition of the shift, and then he returned to his work, the moment passing without spectacle, without applause, but leaving behind something far more lasting. Because in that brief exchange, something had changed that could not be undone, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that truth often does. And as the terminal carried on, filled with movement and noise, there remained a subtle difference in how people moved through it, a little more aware, a little more attentive, as if they had all witnessed something simple yet profound, the moment when respect was no longer assumed, but earned, not through power, but through presence. And Daniel Carter continued forward, just as he always had, only now. The space around him carried the quiet memory of a moment that had revealed far more than anyone expected. The moment passed without spectacle, but it did not disappear. It settled into the rhythm of the terminal like something permanent, something that would quietly shape everything that followed. And Daniel Carter continued his route, moving past Gate 28 and toward the far end of the concourse, his steps steady, his focus unchanged. Yet now every movement carried a subtle awareness from those around him. And as he reached a row of seats near a charging station, he paused briefly to adjust a misplaced bag that had been left partially blocking the walkway, a small act, almost invisible, yet noticed by a woman nearby who offered a quiet thank you. And Daniel simply nodded, returning to his work without hesitation, because for him, nothing had changed, the purpose remained the same. Only the perspective of others had shifted. And across the terminal, Richard Vaughn stood near the operations desk, his posture more relaxed than before, though his expression remained thoughtful, as if he was still processing something that could not be reduced to a simple explanation. And he watched the flow of passengers with a different kind of attention now, not just observing efficiency or movement, but noticing the people within it, the small interactions, the quiet exchanges that had always been there but had gone unseen. And as a group of travelers passed by, he caught sight of the older woman from earlier, now seated comfortably near her gate, her expression calm, her posture at ease. And for a brief moment, their eyes met, and there was no tension, no confrontation, only a silent acknowledgement of what had unfolded. And Vaughn inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. Yet it carried more sincerity than any words he could have chosen. And nearby, the young airport employee continued assisting passengers, her voice steady, her demeanor confident, and she glanced toward Daniel as he passed, offering a respectful smile that he returned with a brief nod. And the TSA officer, standing at his post, maintained his vigilance, though his gaze softened whenever it crossed Daniel's path, a quiet sign of recognition that needed no explanation. And as the afternoon light shifted through the large glass windows, casting long reflections across the polished floor, the terminal seemed to settle into a new kind of balance, one that did not rely solely on authority or hierarchy, but on something more grounded, something earned through consistent action and quiet integrity. And Daniel moved forward through it all without pause, guiding his mop along the floor with the same deliberate care, his reflections steady beneath him. And as he reached the far end of the terminal, he stopped for a moment, looking out toward the runway where planes lifted into the sky one after another, each departure precise, controlled, yet dependent on countless unseen efforts behind the scenes. And he watched for just a second, not with longing, not with distraction, but with quiet understanding, before turning back to his work. And as he did, the space behind him carried the subtle imprint of everything that had been revealed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. Because in that terminal, on that ordinary afternoon, something simple had become undeniable, that the true measure of a person was not found in titles or commands, but in the quiet consistency of who they chose to be when no one was paying attention. And what happened when, for just a moment, everyone finally did? As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the terminal lights softened, casting a warmer glow across the polished floors, and the steady rhythm of travel continued. Yet beneath it all, something remained anchored from earlier, something that had quietly rewritten the way people moved through the space. And Daniel Carter continued his work without pause, moving methodically from one section to another, his presence consistent, grounded, unchanged in intention. And as he passed a cluster of delayed passengers gathered near a departure board, he noticed an elderly man struggling to adjust his carry-on bag onto a nearby seat, the small movement slightly off balance. And without hesitation, Daniel stepped forward, setting his mop aside for a moment, lifting the bag with calm ease and placing it securely, his gesture simple, practiced, and the man looked up with relief, offering a quiet thank you that Daniel acknowledged with a nod before returning to his task. And though the interaction lasted only seconds, it did not go unnoticed. Because now, people were watching differently, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding, and a young woman seated nearby observed the exchange, her expression softening as if something she had witnessed earlier was now being confirmed in real time. And across the terminal, Richard Vaughn stood near the information desk, his posture composed, yet no longer distant from the environment around him. And as he watched Daniel assist the elderly man, there was no immediate reaction, no visible correction, only a quiet stillness that suggested something deeper was taking place within him, a recognition that could not be undone. And he shifted slightly, stepping closer to the flow of passengers rather than remaining apart from it, as if choosing to see rather than oversee. And as a family approached him with a question about their gate, he responded with a level of patience that felt different from before, his tone measured, his attention present. And though it was a small change, it carried significance, because it reflected something that had been reshaped, not by instruction, but by experience. And the young airport employee who had spoken earlier noticed it as well, her gaze briefly moving between Vaughn and Daniel, as if connecting 2 points that had once seemed unrelated. And as the TSA officer continued his watch, his stance steady, he allowed a faint nod to pass unnoticed, acknowledging the quiet transformation unfolding in the space he guarded. And Daniel moved on, continuing his route without interruption, his focus never drifting far from the work at hand. Yet his presence now carried something more, not pride, not recognition, but a quiet affirmation that required no words. And as the final boarding calls echoed across the terminal, blending into the steady cadence of departures, the space held on to what had been revealed, not as a memory, but as a standard, something that would shape the moments that followed. Because what had unfolded was not just a single event, it was a shift in perspective, a reminder that dignity does not announce itself, it reveals itself, often in the quietest ways. And Daniel Carter, moving steadily across the floor, remained exactly who he had always been. Only now, the world around him had finally learned to see it. Even as the evening deepened and the terminal lights reflected like quiet stars across the polished floor, the shift that had taken place earlier continued to echo in ways that could not be measured, not in noise, not in numbers, but in choices. And Daniel Carter moved steadily through the final stretch of his shift, guiding his cart along the now calmer concourse, where fewer passengers remained, their voices softer, their movements slower. And as he approached a seating area near Gate 30, he noticed a young airport employee struggling with a spill that had spread across the floor, her movements uncertain, her pace rushed, and without hesitation, Daniel stepped in beside her, not taking over, not correcting, but guiding, his voice low and steady as he showed her how to angle the mop, how to move with the surface instead of against it. And she listened closely, her earlier confidence returning in small increments. And when she looked up, there was gratitude in her expression, not just for the help, but for the way it was given, quietly, respectfully, without making her feel smaller. And Daniel gave a slight nod before stepping back, allowing her to finish, because his role had never been about being seen, only about making things better where he could. And a few feet away, Richard Vaughn observed the interaction, his posture still, his expression thoughtful, and, for a moment, he remained where he was, watching not just the action, but the manner in which it unfolded, the patience, the humility, the absence of any need for recognition. And something in that moment settled within him, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet acceptance of something he could no longer ignore. And after a brief pause, he took a step forward, then another, closing the distance that had once felt so significant. And when he reached Daniel, he did not raise his voice, did not assert authority. Instead, he spoke with a calm that felt unfamiliar yet genuine. "I handled that wrong earlier," he said, the words simple, unembellished, carrying no excuses, no conditions, only acknowledgement. And for a moment, the space between them held still again, not with tension, but with something quieter, something more grounded. And Daniel looked at him, his expression steady, his eyes calm, and he gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as dismissal, but as recognition, the kind that does not require elaboration. And Vaughn exhaled softly, as if releasing something that had been held too tightly, and he stepped back, not retreating, but allowing the moment to settle naturally. And nearby, The young employee continued her work with renewed confidence, glancing briefly toward Daniel before focusing on the task in front of her, and as the final boarding call echoed across the terminal, signaling the last departures of the evening, the space felt different, not because of any grand gesture, but because of the quiet alignment that had taken place, and Daniel returned to his routine, moving forward with the same steady rhythm, his presence unchanged, yet now carrying a quiet acknowledgement that could not be undone. And as the terminal prepared to close out the day, what remained was not the memory of a command, but the quiet understanding that dignity is not something given by position. It is something revealed through action, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. By the time the final announcement faded into the quiet hum of the nearly empty terminal, the day had settled into a kind of stillness that only comes after something meaningful has passed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a weight that lingers long after the moment itself is gone. And Daniel Carter moved through the last stretch of his shift with the same steady rhythm, guiding his mop along the floor beneath the dimmed lights, his reflection stretching across the polished surface like a quiet echo of everything that had unfolded. And there was no audience now, no gathered crowd, no voices rising in recognition, only the soft sound of distant footsteps and the occasional rolling suitcase. Yet something remained, something that could not be erased by time or routine, because what had been revealed earlier had settled deeper than the surface, into the awareness of those who had witnessed it, and even into the space itself. And as Daniel reached the end of the concourse, he paused, for a brief moment, resting his hands lightly on the handle of his cart, looking out toward the wide glass windows where the last plane of the evening lifted into the darkening sky, its lights blinking steadily as it disappeared into the distance. And in that quiet pause, there was no sense of victory, no reflection of pride, only a calm understanding, the kind that comes from knowing who you are without needing anyone else to confirm it. And behind him, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, and Richard Vaughn stopped a few feet away, his presence no longer imposing, no longer defined by authority, but by something quieter, something more human. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, but settled, as if everything that needed to be said had already been understood. And Vaughn looked around the emptying terminal, then back at Daniel, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, something reflective, something changed, and though no further words were spoken, there was acknowledgement in that moment, a recognition that did not need to be repeated. And after a brief pause, Vaughn gave a small nod before turning and walking away, his steps steady, his posture different than it had been before, not diminished, but grounded. And Daniel watched him go for a second, then returned his attention to the floor, pushing the mop forward. Once more, continuing the work that had never stopped, the work that had always defined him. And as the terminal lights dimmed further and the final gates closed for the night, the space settled into silence, carrying with it the quiet imprint of what had taken place, not as a memory of conflict, but as a reminder of something far more enduring, that dignity does not arrive with noise, it reveals itself in stillness, in consistency, in the way a person chooses to show up when no one is watching. And in that terminal, on that ordinary day, the world had paused just long enough to see it, and in seeing it, it had changed, even if only a little, even if only for those who were there. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments are not the ones that demand attention, but the ones that quietly redefine it. And as Daniel Carter moved steadily through the final stretch of his shift, the floor beneath him reflected more than light. It reflected a truth that would remain long after the night had passed. That respect is not something you command, it is something you reveal, and once revealed, it belongs not to one person, but to everyone who chooses to see it.